Ethan Miller opened his eyes to find 300 wedding guests staring at him, a priest clearing his throat for the third time, and his own hands trembling inside a pair of white gloves he did not remember putting on. Okay. New information. He was standing at the altar of the Winthrop Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, wearing a tuxedo so white it practically glowed under the chandeliers, and someone had just asked him, "Do you take James Carter to be your lawfully wedded spouse?" Ethan's first thought was, I really should have finished that spreadsheet before I died. His second thought arrived a half-second later, cooler and more useful, the way thoughts used to arrive back when his job was staring at financial statements until they confessed their secrets. He was a data analyst, had been, 29 years old, 3 energy drinks a day, a corner desk at a mid-size firm in Boston, allergic to small talk in overtime meetings. None of that explained the altar. None of that explained why his own hands felt smaller, or why a second set of memories was unpacking itself in his skull like a badly labeled moving truck. Ethan Miller, 27, Omega, weak-willed, the sad footnote in somebody's overwrought romance novel. He almost laughed. He would have if 300 people weren't watching him decide whether to ruin his own wedding. Great. I spent my whole life reading spreadsheets, and somehow the universe decided the best use of my analytical talents was becoming a professional disappointment in a book I skimmed once on a plane. I don't even remember the ending. I definitely don't remember signing up for a live-action version. He didn't panic. Panicking was for people with the energy to panic, and frankly, Ethan had never had that kind of energy even before he'd apparently died and been reincarnated into somebody's tragic subplot. Instead, he did what any reasonable analyst would do. He assessed the data. Groom visibly relieved. Groom's mother visibly smug. A folder of pre-signed documents sitting suspiciously close to the altar, angled just enough for Ethan to catch the words asset transfer before the priest cleared his throat again. So, not a wedding, a hostile takeover with a string quartet. Actually, Ethan said, in a voice that came out far steadier than he expected, I'd like to read the paperwork first. The priest blinked. James Carter's smile flickered like a bad Wi-Fi signal. Ethan picked up the folder, because apparently even reincarnated into a story, he could still spot a predatory clause at 40 feet, and started reading out loud, calmly, the way he used to read line items to executives who thought numbers were beneath them. 3 sentences in, Victoria Carter's smug expression collapsed into something considerably less smug. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a man in a navy suit had gone very, very still. Ethan didn't know his name yet. He would soon. The internet would call him the January Dawn, and half of Chicago would flinch at the sound of it. Right now he was just a stranger with sharp eyes and an unreadable mouth, watching a supposedly fragile Omega dismantle a wedding contract in real time, like it was a Tuesday chore. Ethan glanced up, caught him staring, and gave a small, tired shrug, the universal signal for, yeah, I don't know either, buddy. He had no idea that shrug would haunt William Blackwood for weeks. If you like your romances served with a side of chaos, a hero with zero patience for nonsense, and a healer amount of workplace sarcasm, go ahead and hit follow, because this wedding disaster was only the opening act, and things get significantly messier from here. And honestly, Ethan was already exhausted. He hadn't even had coffee yet. Turns out, waking up in the middle of someone else's chaos comes with paperwork, a lot of it, and apparently a wedding folder was just the appetizer. By the time security ushered me into a private lounge, for everyone's safety, Victoria Carter had said, in a tone that suggested my safety was not actually the concern. I'd had roughly 11 minutes to accept 2 facts. 1. I was dead, or transferred, or whatever the technical term was for waking up in a stranger's body mid-ceremony. 2. That stranger's life came with an HR file's worth of baggage, and none of it looked good on paper. My name, his name, our name. I hadn't worked out the pronoun logistics yet, was Ethan Miller. 27 years old, Omega. Second child of the Miller family, a name that used to mean something in Chicago 3 generations ago, and now mostly meant the family that still shows up to galas, even though everyone knows they can't afford the good seats. The old Ethan, according to the memories currently rearranging themselves in my skull like moving boxes nobody labeled, had been sickly, quiet, prone to blushing at the mere mention of an alpha's name. The kind of Omega high society described as delicate in the same tone they used for antique china, pretty, fragile, and only valuable because of who might want to own it. I, on the other hand, had spent the last 6 years of my actual life squinting at quarterly earnings reports until they gave up their secrets. Data analyst, Boston. Third floor cubicle with a chair that squeaked exactly when I didn't want it to. I did not blush at names. I cross-referenced them. And honestly, my single greatest life skill was doing the minimum amount of visible effort required to be left alone. A skill that, it turned out, was about to become extremely relevant. "He's stable," a doctor was telling Victoria Carter through the door, apparently under the impression I couldn't hear through drywall built sometime before the invention of good drywall. Some kind of shock. He'll need rest. Rest, I thought. Sure. Let's call it that. Victoria Carter, 58 beta, always dressed like she was one bad headline away from suing someone, swept into the room a moment later in a cream suit so sharp it could file its own taxes. Her silver hair was arranged with the kind of precision that suggested a stylist, a prayer, and possibly a hostage situation. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stain you were still deciding whether to pay someone to remove. "You gave everyone quite a fright," she said, in a voice that had never once in its life sounded frightened. "Reading contracts out loud at your own wedding. Very theatrical." "I like to know what I'm signing," I said. Old Ethan, apparently, had never said a sentence like that in his life, because Victoria's eyebrows went up half an inch, which for a woman with that much precision Botox was basically a full gasp. "James is willing to overlook it," she said, which was Victoria, for James is embarrassed and I am furious, and we are pretending both of those things are generosity. "The wedding will proceed once you've rested." Ah, there it was, the rules of the game, delivered with a smile sharp enough to open mail. Here's what I pieced together over the next several hours, mostly by reading old Ethan's memories like case files, and mostly by eavesdropping, because nobody guards their secrets around someone they've already decided is harmless. The Miller and Carter families had an arrangement going back 2 years, a marriage contract dressed up as a love story for the society pages. My family got debt relief and a seat at tables we couldn't otherwise afford. The Carters got an Omega with a rare, near-mythical compatibility rating, the kind old-money alpha families still whispered about, even though the law had recognized Omega rights for decades. Legally, nobody could force anyone to marry anyone. Socially, in this particular zip code, legally was a technicality people worked around the same way they worked around parking tickets. James Carter, 30 alpha, CEO of Carter Technologies, jawline aggressively symmetrical, wasn't marrying me because he loved me. He was marrying me because a Carter with a devoted, delicate Omega on his arm photographed beautifully at shareholder events. He didn't want me. He wanted the picture of me. I didn't need old Ethan's memories to figure that out. I just needed to watch him check his own reflection in the window 3 times during a 5-minute conversation. Okay, I thought, lying on a couch that cost more than my old apartment's rent, staring at a ceiling I did not choose. Analyst brain, do your thing. What's the fastest, lowest effort way out of a contract wedding? Old me would have built a spreadsheet. New me, trapped in a body that fainted if you looked at it wrong according to the file, had exactly one asset. Everyone already thought I was useless, which, if you think about it, is an incredible strategic position. Nobody watches the person they've already dismissed. So, plan, stay dismissed, be so aggressively, boringly harmless that James calls the whole thing off himself, and I get to go live a quiet, over-caffeinated life somewhere far from cream-colored suits, ideally with significantly more napping involved. If there's one thing 11 months of corporate burnout teaches you, it's that the truly enlightened path in any crisis is always the one that involves the least amount of standing up. It went fine for about 4 hours. Then Lucas Carter found me. Lucas Carter, 26, alpha, James's younger brother, forever dressed in a blazer thrown over what was very clearly a band t-shirt, because apparently even Carter money couldn't buy him a personality that matched his family's. He had a habit of flipping a poker chip across his knuckles whenever he was bored, which was always. "You're the guy who read the prenup out loud," he said, dropping into the chair across from me without asking, the way people do when they've never once in their life worried about being unwelcome. That was either the dumbest or ballsiest thing I've seen at a Carter event, and I've seen my aunt fight a valet over a parking spot. "I get nervous," I said, deploying old Ethan's signature soft apologetic blink. "Numbers make me anxious. I just wanted to look busy." Lucas studied me for a second too long. "Huh," he said. "Funny." "You didn't look nervous. You looked like you were grating it. I felt my stomach drop about an inch. Noted. Lucas Carter, unlike his brother, actually paid attention. I get that a lot, I said, and changed the subject by asking him where the coffee was, which, thankfully, worked because nothing derails a rich 26-year-old faster than the opportunity to explain something. He led me toward the kitchen, Chip still spinning across his fingers, chattering about the family's private blend of Italian roast like it was a personality trait. Somewhere behind us, in the hallway, I caught a flash of navy suit and felt the back of my neck do something involuntary and deeply annoying. William Blackwood, standing near a window with a phone he wasn't actually looking at, which, I would learn, was his signature move for watching a room without appearing to watch it. 33. Alpha. Head of an empire people in this city referred to in hushed, respectful tones, the kind usually reserved for weather systems and IRS audits. They called him the January Dawn. Nobody had ever fully explained why to me, and something told me that not knowing was probably safer. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the space I'd just occupied 30 seconds earlier, like he was replaying something. Great, I thought. The one person in this building who actually seems dangerous just watched me almost blow my own cover in front of the one guy who notices things. Fantastic start. 10 out of 10. No notes. I ducked into the kitchen before he could turn around, grabbed a mug that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget back in Boston, and told myself the day couldn't possibly get more complicated. That was, of course, before Victoria Carter appeared in the doorway with a smile that did not reach her eyes and the words, "Wonderful, you're up. The engagement dinner is tonight, and everyone will want to see for themselves that you're recovered. Right. Because nothing says recovered like an audience of Chicago's finest watching me try to convincingly fail at being interesting for 3 straight hours. I looked down at my coffee. Well, I thought, guess I'm about to find out exactly how good an actor a professional spreadsheet nerd can be. On 0 hours of sleep and even less enthusiasm. Here's what nobody tells you about faking incompetence for a living. It's exhausting. You'd think being useless would be the easy option. It is not. Being useless convincingly requires the kind of sustained performance most Broadway actors would unionize against. And I was doing it on a schedule that left 0 room for my other, far more important, life goal of napping whenever physically possible. But I had a plan, and the plan was simple. Be so unbearable that James Carter called off the wedding himself, before dessert if possible. The engagement dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant with no visible prices on the menu, which is how you know a place is expensive. The absence of numbers is itself a number. I sat between James and an empty chair reserved, apparently, for whoever William feels like bringing, which turned out to be nobody, because William Blackwood arrived alone, unbothered, and immediately made the empty chair feel like a deliberate statement. My plan was elegant in its simplicity. Order the most obnoxiously expensive thing on the menu. Eat like a raccoon who'd broken into a picnic, and let James's ego do the rest. I'll have the Wagyu, I told the waiter, and the lobster, and whatever that thing is that costs more than my rent. That would be the caviar service, sir. Sure. That too. James's smile flickered, but he recovered fast. This was, after all, an audience of investors, and nothing ruins a photo op like visible irritation. Get whatever you like, he said, loud enough for the table, low enough to sound like a threat. Charming. I ate. I ate with genuine, undisguised enthusiasm because, full disclosure, the food was incredible, and old Ethan's picky stomach had apparently never experienced a proper meal in his short, delicate life. I stopped performing about 4 bites in and just enjoyed myself. Loudly, inelegantly. I may have made a noise over the Wagyu that caused Victoria Carter to set down her fork. Someone's got an appetite, Lucas said, delighted, flipping his poker chip. I contain multitudes, I said, mouth half full. Across the table, William Blackwood was watching me with an expression I couldn't read yet. Later, I'd learned to call it his filing something away face, while eating his own meal with the kind of restrained precision that suggested he'd never once in his life gotten sauce on his cuff. I expected James to be appalled. Instead, halfway through my second plate, he leaned toward his mother and murmured something that ended with the words endearing, actually, and Victoria's face did the complicated thing where it tried to agree and disagree simultaneously. Endearing. I nearly choked on a piece of lobster. You should see him with dessert, Lucas added helpfully, which was not helping. Round 1. Complete failure. I had not been dismissed as gluttonous and embarrassing. I had been filed under charmingly unpretentious, which, if you know old money, is somehow worse, because rich people love nothing more than a poor person who makes them feel down to earth by association. 2 nights later, I tried again, this time at a charity gala where half of Chicago's alpha elite were milling around in tuxedos, sipping drinks with names longer than my old rent checks. The plan: be clumsy, spectacularly, undeniably clumsy. Knock something over, trip in front of a camera. Give James a reason to quietly, mercifully end this before the photographer arrived. I found a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses, and with the kind of tragic elegance I did not know I had, managed to trip directly into his path. The tray went flying. Champagne went everywhere. I went down with it, landing in a puddle of my own making, in front of at least 6 people holding phones. Perfect, I thought, lying on the marble floor in a growing lake of Dom Perignon. This is the one. This has to be the one. James rushed over, good, on schedule, knelt beside me, and in front of every camera in the room, gently brushed a piece of glass off my sleeve with the tenderness of a man auditioning for Husband of the Year. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice pitched perfectly for the room. "I'm fine," I said, through gritted teeth, both because I was mortified and because a shard of glass had in fact nicked my palm, and I was actively bleeding onto a floor that probably cost more per square foot than my old apartment. "He's so delicate," I heard someone whisper. "Poor thing, I am not delicate. I am covered in Dom Perignon and mild rage. James helped me up like I weighed nothing, which fine old Ethan's body was annoyingly light, and the room awed collectively, and I realized, with the particular horror of watching your own plan detonate in your face, that I had just handed James Carter the most photogenic moment of his engagement. The gala photos ran the next morning under a headline that made me want to lie face down on the floor again, this time on purpose. Carter's devoted fiancé, a love story written in champagne. I stared at my ceiling that morning, wondering if the universe had a personal vendetta against my specific brand of sabotage, and also whether I could file a formal complaint about it somewhere. By round 3, I'd downgraded my expectations from brilliant plan to anything, please, anything. I would like to sleep before 9 p.m. at least once this month. I decided to weaponize stupidity in a boardroom. Of all places, James had insisted I observe a strategy meeting, presumably so I could watch him look important. My plan: interrupt with an idea so painfully naive that everyone in the room would collectively agree I had no business being anywhere near a family with a technology company. They were stuck on a supply chain bottleneck, some tangled mess involving 3 vendors and a shipping delay that had eaten 2 weeks of meetings. I raised my hand like a kid in detention. What if you just had them shipped to the closer warehouse instead? The one in Ohio? Isn't that like, right there? I said it in the dumbest voice I could manage, the vocal equivalent of a shrug, silence. Then the head of logistics, a man who had clearly not slept properly in 14 days, turned very slowly toward the screen, pulled up a map, and went pale. "That actually works," he said. "That solves the whole thing." No, I thought. No, absolutely not. Put it back. I did not mean to be helpful. I was trying to sound like a golden retriever who wandered into a shareholders' meeting. "Huh," said James, visibly recalculating something behind his eyes. And there, at the far end of the table, William Blackwood, whose logistics company happened to own the Ohio warehouse in question, a detail I would only learn later, and would very much have appreciated knowing beforehand, set down his coffee and looked at me the way you'd look at a math problem that had just solved itself out of spite. I gave him my best empty smile. He did not smile back. He just kept looking, like he was rereading a paragraph he'd misunderstood the first time. Great. I'd accidentally solve a logistics crisis in front of the scariest man in Chicago, who apparently owns the solution to the list of things I did not mean to do this week. If you'd asked me at any point in my old life whether I would one day accidentally hack a private security system while wearing silk pajamas that cost more than my old couch, I would have said absolutely not, and also, what? It happened because I skipped a dinner. Too tired, I told James's assistant, which was mostly true. Performing exhaustingly incompetent for a week straight will do that to a person, and retreated to the guest wing of William's penthouse, where the Carters had, for reasons still unclear to me, decided a compatibility retreat was a good idea. I had zero interest in socializing, so I found the least populated hallway, sat down with my back against a very expensive wall, and noticed the security panel beside the elevator, blinking an error code that made my old analyst instincts twitch. I did not mean to fix it. I want that on record. My hands simply moved the way hands do when they've spent 6 years solving problems for a living. I saw a misconfigured access loop, and some deeply buried, deeply unhelpful part of my brain went, well, that's just sloppy. And 20 minutes later the panel was humming along perfectly, and so was, apparently, an override I hadn't meant to trigger, because the elevator doors slid open right as William Blackwood stepped out of them looking mildly murderous. "You're not supposed to be able to do that," he said, staring at the panel, then at me, then at the panel again. "Do what?" I said, in the most convincingly innocent voice a man holding a screwdriver he had no memory of picking up could manage. "That's a private security override. It took my team 3 weeks to install." "I was bored," I said. "I like puzzles. You broke into my building's security system because you were bored. I prefer improved. I'm doing you a favor. You're welcome." He looked at me for a long moment, the same filing something away look from the dinner, except sharper now, less curious, more suspicious, like a man who has just found a second set of footprints in a house he thought was empty. "Are you unwell?" he asked. "You don't seem unwell." "I'm exhausted," I said, and it wasn't even a lie. "I'm just exhausted in a very skilled way." For 1 full second, William Blackwood, a man reputed to have never once lost his composure in a business meeting, a courtroom, or, according to rumor, a hostage negotiation, laughed, not a big laugh. A short, startled exhale through the nose, gone almost as fast as it came, like his own face had betrayed him and he was already regretting it. It was, annoyingly, a good laugh. "Okay, quick poll, if you're keeping score at home, was the homecoming-style deflection technique too obvious, or exactly obvious enough? I'd genuinely love other sabotage ideas for next time. Drop your best convince a Mafia king your harmless strategy in the comments, because clearly mine isn't working. I didn't have an answer of my own. What I had instead was William Blackwood, arms crossed, studying me the way you'd study a locked door you were suddenly certain wasn't locked at all. "You know," he said slowly, "everyone keeps telling me you're delicate." "I am extremely delicate," I said. "I just fixed your entire security grid while delicate. That's not delicate, that's dangerous. Same thing, different fonts." He didn't laugh again, but something in his expression shifted, recalibrated, like he'd been reading a book with the wrong cover on it and had just caught a glimpse of the real title underneath. "I don't think," he said, quiet enough that I almost missed it. "You're who everyone thinks you are." I opened my mouth to deflect, to deploy some new layer of harmless nonsense, and found, for possibly the first time since waking up at that altar, that I had absolutely nothing clever to say. Which was, unfortunately, the most suspicious reaction of all. None of it, as it turned out, mattered. Because 2 days later, James announced the wedding was back on. No discussion, no delay. It took me exactly 1 gossip column to figure out why. After the champagne headlines and the boardroom idea that somehow made James's company look brilliant by association, calling off the engagement would have read as James rejecting a devoted, delightfully quirky Omega for no good reason. His ego could survive almost anything except bad press, and I had, against every intention, become excellent press. The next test arrived with a name tag and a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and honestly, I should have seen it coming, because nothing in this family ever just happened. Victoria Carter announced it over brunch, the way she announced most disasters, casually, between bites of grapefruit, like she was mentioning the weather. "You'll be delighted to know," she said, not looking delighted at all, "that Chloe will be joining us this week. She's a dear family friend, very accomplished." Chloe Reynolds, 24, Omega, 3rd generation old money, the kind whose family tree had more branches than a subway map, and, according to the whispered gossip I absorbed within 4 minutes of meeting her, recently between engagements, which is high society for recently single and shopping for an upgrade. She arrived wearing a dress the color of a threat, and carrying a clutch small enough to suggest she'd never once in her life needed to carry anything herself. "So this is Ethan," she said, looking me over the way you'd look over a used car you were being pressured to buy. "James speaks about you so often." "Does he?" I said. "I speak about myself never, so we're even." Her smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes recalculated. I'd learned fast that Chloe Reynolds operate exactly like every hostile takeover I'd ever analyzed in my old life. Friendly opening bid, gradually escalating pressure, exit strategy already drafted before the first handshake. The test came 2 days later, at a private art auction. I'd had quite enough of galas for one lifetime, thank you, and apparently so had the Carters, because this one at least had the decency to serve better appetizers. Chloe cornered me by a dessert table off to the side, which, tactically, was a mistake on her part, because I do not get distracted near dessert tables, I get focused. You know, she said, swirling her champagne. James and I dated for 2 years, before you. A beat perfectly timed. Before your family needed the money, I mean. There it was, the opening bid. She wanted me flustered, defensive, maybe crying into the creme brulee so she could swoop in as the composed, superior alternative. Instead, I picked up a small dessert plate, considered the eclairs, and said, without looking up, "That's so interesting, because James told me you two never actually dated." He said, and I quote, "We went to homecoming as friends because neither of us had anyone else." I selected an eclair, which, respectfully, tracks. Somewhere behind me, I heard Lucas Carter make a sound like he was actively fighting his own laughter to death. Chloe's champagne flute paused halfway to her mouth. "That's not," she started, and then visibly recalibrated because arguing the point further would only confirm it. "He's changed the story before." "Sure," I said. "People do that. Especially people avoiding uncomfortable truths at dessert tables." I took a bite of the eclair. Excellent, by the way. Would be publicly humiliated near it again. You want a real tip? If you're trying to make someone jealous, don't bring up homecoming. Bring up something that actually happened. It's more convincing. For one glorious second, Chloe Reynolds had absolutely nothing to say, which, I was beginning to learn, was the single most satisfying sound in the world, better than any applause, a socialite mid-scheme, mouth open, brain buffering. She recovered fast, credit where due. "We'll see how long you last," she said, in the tone of someone delivering a threat disguised as a compliment, and swept off toward Victoria, who was watching the whole exchange with an expression I couldn't fully decode, somewhere between fury and, disturbingly, the tiniest flicker of respect. I didn't get long to enjoy the win, because that was the same night Nathan Cole decided to introduce himself to the rest of my problems. Nathan Cole, 31, alpha, CEO of a real estate empire out of Austin, the kind of tan that suggested he owned at least one yacht purely for photo purposes. He had a laugh that carried across rooms and a habit of touching people's shoulders a beat too long when he talked to them, which he demonstrated immediately by doing it to me. "Ethan Miller," he said, like my name was a business opportunity he was excited about. "I've heard a lot about you." "Concerning," I said. "From who?" "Everyone." He smiled, all teeth, and lowered his voice like we were already close friends conspiring against the room. "You know, a rare compatibility rating like yours doesn't come around often. Seems like a waste, tying it to a company man like James. A guy like that wants a Carter in every photo. He doesn't actually want you." It was, annoyingly, not wrong. But I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "And you'd want me for my personality, I assume," I said. "Very romantic." "I'd want you," he said, leaning in slightly, "for how interesting you clearly are." A Carter doesn't deserve interesting. I was fully prepared to deploy some tired, harmless deflection. Old Ethan's whole toolkit was built for exactly this, the soft blink, the "oh, you flatter me" nonsense, when a voice arrived from somewhere over my left shoulder, low and even, the kind of calm that makes a room go quiet without anyone telling it to. "Nathan." William Blackwood didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was, I was learning, precisely the problem with him. He didn't need volume. He just needed to exist in your immediate vicinity, looking mildly disappointed, and grown men apparently reorganized their entire personalities around it. "Will." Nathan's smile didn't falter, but his hand came off my shoulder fast enough to suggest a memory of some previous, less pleasant encounter. Just getting acquainted with the guest of honor. "He's not a prize at your table," William said. "Try somewhere else." "Relax," Nathan said, holding up both hands, though his eyes stayed on me a beat too long. "I'm just saying, an omega like Ethan should end up with an alpha who actually knows how to protect what's his." There was a pause, a very specific, loaded pause, the kind that in old Ethan's memories usually preceded something dramatic, a raised voice, a thrown drink, the kind of scene that makes the society pages. Instead, William tilted his head very slightly, the way you'd look at someone who'd just said something mildly confusing. "Whose exactly," he said, "are you talking about?" Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. There was, somewhere in there, the distinct sound of a man doing math he did not want to do. I bit down on the inside of my cheek to keep from grinning, because, okay, fine, I'll admit it, that was, objectively, one of the coolest things anyone had ever said in my immediate vicinity, and my old analyst brain, the one that had spent 6 years being unimpressed by everything, filed it away with something suspiciously close to butterflies, which was inconvenient and unprofessional, and absolutely not something I had budgeted time for this week. Nathan laughed it off, made some excuse about finding his drink, and disappeared into the crowd with the specific speed of a man choosing strategic retreat over further embarrassment. William turned to me. For a second, his expression did something I hadn't seen it do before. Not the careful blankness, not the filing something away look, but something almost sheepish, like he'd surprised himself. "You didn't need me to do that," he said. "No," I agreed. But it was very satisfying to watch. Chef's kiss. Would recommend. I wasn't trying to be entertaining. "You were extremely entertaining," I said. "You should charge admission." He looked, briefly, like he wanted to argue, and then didn't, which, from a man reputed to never lose an argument, felt like its own small victory. I would have enjoyed that victory a lot longer if I hadn't. 20 minutes later, wandered toward the coat check and overheard something that made my stomach do a slow, unpleasant drop. Daniel Reed, 45, beta, always somewhere near James with a tablet and an expression like he was mentally billing you for his time, was tucked into an alcove near the kitchen doors, phone pressed to his ear, voice low but not quite low enough. "Just keep pushing Chloe forward. It doesn't matter if James actually picks her. We just need the optics of an alternative." A pause. "No, Nathan's helpful too. Anything that makes Blackwood territorial is good for us, keeps everyone's eyes off the transfer paperwork." I froze behind a very large decorative plant, holding a canapé I no longer had any interest in eating. Daniel lowered his voice further, and I only caught the tail end, but it was more than enough. "Once the second signature clears, none of this will matter anyway." He hung up, straightened his jacket, walked back into the party with the easy, unbothered stride of a man who had absolutely no idea he'd just handed me the first real thread of a much bigger problem. I stood there behind the plant for a solid 10 seconds, canapé forgotten, brain doing the thing it used to do best, quietly, methodically assembling disconnected pieces into a shape I didn't like. Second signature, optics of an alternative. Transfer paperwork. This wasn't just an overbearing mother and an ego-driven fiancé anymore. Somebody was running this whole operation like a spreadsheet, and Daniel Reed had just accidentally shown me the first tab. I set the canapé down on a passing tray, straightened my own jacket, and went to go find out exactly what page 2 looked like, mentally filing away, with real regret, that I would probably not be getting my early bedtime after all. I found William later that night, alone on the penthouse terrace, tie loosened, looking out at a Chicago skyline that probably owed him money. I still had a canapé-shaped hole in my composure, and a phone call's worth of dread sitting in my stomach, but there was something about the way he stood there, still, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world even though I was fairly sure he didn't. That made me put the Daniel Reed problem down for exactly one conversation. "You're doing the thing again," he said, without turning around. "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're solving a problem nobody assigned you." "Occupational hazard," I said, and joined him at the railing. "So, random question. Do you believe in fate? Or is that beneath a man with a security system I've now personally improved twice?" He almost smiled. Almost. I didn't, until a few months ago. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small. A coin, old and worn smooth at the edges, the kind of object that had clearly been handled 1,000 times by someone who couldn't quite let it go. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to not make it weird." "No promises," I said, "but continue." 11 years ago, he said, turning the coin over in his fingers. I was 22. My father had just died, and half the city thought that meant the Blackwood organization was there for the taking. I was in over my head in a negotiation that would have ended very badly for a lot of people, including me. There was a kid there, younger than me, some analyst's assistant nobody important enough to notice, who slipped me a note under the table with 3 numbers on it. Account routing information. It's the only reason I walked out of that room still breathing, financially or otherwise. I felt something in my chest do a slow, unfamiliar tilt. "I never saw his face," William went on. "Just his handwriting, sloppy, fast, Like whoever wrote it had better things to do and was mildly annoyed about the delay. A pause. I kept the note for years, lost it eventually. But I never forgot the handwriting. He held out the one side, barely visible. Someone had scratched 3 tiny digits into the metal. A private joke, a signature, a habit I recognized immediately because it was, unmistakably, mine. Old me, real life me. The specific way I abbreviated routing numbers when I was in a hurry, a tic I'd had since my first internship, the same tic that had apparently outlived several career changes, one wedding, and evidently an entire reincarnation. I annotate things I don't have time to explain, I said slowly, staring at the coin like it might bite me. It's a bad habit. My old boss used to yell at me about it. Old boss, William repeated, very carefully, like he was placing a puzzle piece he'd been holding for 11 years, and was almost afraid it would fit. I was an analyst, I said before. In a life that apparently doesn't exist anymore, in a city that isn't this one, doing an internship I don't remember being important enough for anyone to remember except me, he said. I remembered. We stood there for a second, the whole ridiculous, impossible shape of it settling into place. A favor passed under a table over a decade ago, a stranger's handwriting kept in a jacket pocket, through God knows how many negotiations, a coincidence that wasn't actually a coincidence at all, because apparently the universe had decided, somewhere far above both our pay grades, that we were going to end up back in the same room no matter how many lifetimes it took. It should have been the kind of moment you cry at. My chest certainly seemed to think so, doing something tight and warm and thoroughly unprofessional. Instead, I looked at the coin, looked at him, and said, "So what you're telling me is, you've been carrying my terrible handwriting around in your pocket for 11 years like a Victorian romantic." He blinked. "That is not the takeaway I expected. It's the only takeaway I have the emotional bandwidth for right now," I said. "I just found out I saved your life as a teenager and then got reincarnated into your fiancé's failed wedding. My brain can hold one revelation per week, tops, and it already used this week's on the security panel." He huffed something that was almost a laugh, low and surprised, and reached over to close my fingers around the coin before I could hand it back. "Keep it," he said. "It's yours anyway. That's disgustingly sentimental for a man they call the January Dawn. Don't tell anyone." "I'm considering a billboard," I said, but I closed my hand around the coin anyway, and something in my chest settled into place the way old data finally matches a new report. Quiet, certain, undeniable. I didn't get to enjoy the certainty for very long, because that was the exact moment my phone buzzed with a message from Lucas, 3 words long, and considerably less romantic than anything that had just happened on that terrace. "Wedding's back on. Tomorrow." And underneath it, a second message from a number I didn't recognize that made the warmth in my chest go very cold, very fast. "Play along tomorrow, or your family finds out exactly what asset transfer means. DR." I did not sleep that night, which was inconvenient, because I do my best thinking horizontal and unconscious. Instead, I spent the hours before dawn on William's terrace with a legal pad, the coin in my pocket, and the specific, focused calm of a man who has just been threatened and discovered he is, annoyingly furious about it. "Walk me through it again," William said, arms crossed, watching me sketch out a flowchart like it was a crime scene, which, generously, it kind of was. "Daniel's been running 2 things at once," I said. 1, the optics campaign, Chloe, Nathan, all of it, keeping everyone's eyes on my supposed love triangle instead of the actual paperwork. 2, an asset transfer buried in the wedding contract that needs a second signature, mine, to activate. He's been feeding James's ego and Victoria's image obsession this whole time, but neither of them actually knows about the transfer. Daniel's skimming off the top and letting the Carters think it's a normal prenup, and he thinks scaring you keeps you quiet. He thinks he's dealing with a delicate Omega who faints at spreadsheets, I said. He has severely misjudged his opponent. William looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable and warm behind the usual composure. "So what's the play?" I tapped my pen against the legal pad. We let him think it worked. The wedding, round 2, against all my better instincts, was set for the following evening, back at the Winthrop Grand, back under the same chandeliers, in front of an even bigger crowd, because apparently nothing brings out Chicago's elite faster than the smell of a scandal, trying very hard to look like a fairy tale. I played my part, quiet at the rehearsal, compliant at the final fitting. When Chloe found me backstage to gloat, I let her gloat. When Nathan sent a smug little, "shame it didn't work out" text, I left him on read, which, if you know Nathan, is its own kind of punishment. And when William and I had words in the hallway the night before, loud enough for at least 2 Carter cousins to overhear, cold enough to make it convincing, I nearly felt bad about how well it worked. Nearly, Daniel Reed's face, spotted through a half-open door, looked like Christmas had come early. He had no idea Christmas was, in fact, about to be cancelled. The ceremony began exactly on schedule, string quartet and all, and I walked down that same aisle in that same absurd white tuxedo, folder of documents already tucked discreetly against my side. Because if there's one thing this reincarnation had taught me, it's that a well-timed paper trail beats a dramatic speech every single time. "Do you take James Carter?" the priest began. "Actually," I said, "before we get to that, I have some paperwork I'd like to share. Consider it a wedding gift." To everyone, a ripple went through the crowd, the specific hush of 300 rich people simultaneously realizing they might be about to witness something worth gossiping about for years. James's smile cracked. "Ethan?" "This will only take a second," I said pleasantly, and opened the folder. "So, fun fact about wedding contracts. If you read them, and I do recommend it, genuinely, it's a great hobby, you'll find a clause buried on page 41 requiring my signature to authorize a transfer of Miller family assets into a shell account managed by, and I want to get this exactly right." I glanced down, Reed Strategic Holdings. Somewhere in the 3rd row, Daniel Reed went very, very still. "Reed," Victoria repeated slowly, turning to look at him. As in Daniel Reed," I said, "your trusted family advisor, who has spent the last several weeks orchestrating a truly impressive little campaign to keep everyone distracted while this contract quietly funneled Miller assets. And, if you check page 52, a decent chunk of Carter assets too, into an account he controls." The room's collective attention swiveled toward Daniel with the speed of a herd changing direction. "This is a misunderstanding," Daniel said, tablet clutched like a shield. "I would never." "You would, though," I said. "You did, I have the call. Would you like me to play it?" I recorded it on my phone, which, fun fact, I was holding behind a decorative plant at the auction, which is a truly humbling place to have your entire scheme unravel, but here we are. I pressed play. Daniel's own voice filled the ballroom, tinny and unmistakable. "Keeps everyone's eyes off the transfer paperwork. Once the second signature clears, none of this will matter anyway." The silence that followed had texture. "You could have sliced it and served it at the reception." "You threatened my family," I added, almost as an afterthought, holding up my phone. "In writing, from a number registered, and this is the part I find genuinely embarrassing on your behalf, to your company email domain. You used your work account to send a threat. That's not a scheme, Daniel. That's a resignation letter with extra steps." Somewhere behind me, Lucas made a strangled sound that was very clearly a laugh he was trying, and failing, to swallow. "I want that on a shirt," he said, not quietly enough. "Threats sent via company email. Merch. I'm serious." Chloe, 3 feet from Daniel, took one look at the unfolding disaster and very visibly recalculated her entire social strategy, stepping backward like his scandal might be contagious. Nathan, near the bar, suddenly discovered an urgent need to check his phone. Victoria Carter turned on Daniel with the particular fury of a woman, realizing her trusted advisor had been quietly stealing from her for months, while she was busy being cruel to the wrong person. "You've been managing our accounts for 11 years, she said, voice climbing. 11 years, Daniel. Victoria, I can explain." "Explain it to the board," she snapped, "and possibly to a federal auditor." She turned then to me, stiff, visibly rearranging her entire understanding of the last several weeks in real time. "I owe you an apology," she said, in the clipped, efficient tone of a woman who had clearly never practiced saying those particular words and was not enjoying the experience. "I was wrong about you, publicly, which is, I imagine, the only kind of wrong that matters in this room." "Duly noted," I said. "I'll allow it. Mostly because the alternative was watching you find out about page 52 on your own, and I don't think your blood pressure could take it." Victoria's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, before she turned back to Daniel with renewed, focused fury, which felt, honestly, like the correct use of her energy. James, to his credit, looked genuinely stunned, which was the first honest expression I'd seen on his face since I woke up in this body. "You used our wedding," he said slowly, "to launder money." "I used your wedding to launder money efficiently," Daniel said, which was somehow the worst possible thing he could have said, because it confirmed everything and impressed absolutely no one. That was when William stepped forward, unhurried as ever, and the entire room seemed to lean toward him without meaning to. "Mr. Reed," he said, in the low, even voice that had made grown alphas reconsider their life choices at 3 separate galas this month alone. "I'd stay very still if I were you. My legal team has been sitting in the back of this room for the last 20 minutes, and they get very excited about clean paper trails." Daniel looked toward the back row, where 4 people in identical dark suits were, indeed, sitting with the specific stillness of predators who had already ordered dessert. "This isn't over," Daniel said, because apparently every cornered schemer in history says some version of that sentence, regardless of how untrue it is. "It's extremely over," I said. I checked, page 60. "There's a clause for that too." William reached over and gently, deliberately, took the folder out of my hands, setting it down on a nearby table like he was closing a very satisfying business meeting. Then he looked at me, not at Daniel, not at James, not at the entire stunned ballroom, just at me, and said, quiet enough that it somehow carried anyway, "Told you he wasn't who everyone thought he was." The room, predictably, lost its mind. Daniel was escorted out by hotel security. Roughly 4 minutes later, tablet still clutched to his chest like a security blanket, muttering something about lawyers that nobody in that ballroom seemed remotely worried about. James stood frozen at the altar, staring at the wreckage of a wedding he'd apparently never actually understood the terms of, looking like a man already rehearsing his statement to the board. Quick poll, because I need to know. Was that enough? Or should Daniel have had to walk out to a slow clap? Comment your verdict. I take my public humiliations very seriously. Lucas appeared at my elbow, grinning like he'd just watched his favorite sports team win in overtime. "That was the best wedding I've ever been to," he said, "and I've been to 4 of my own cousins." "Glad I could provide entertainment," I said, still faintly buzzing with adrenaline, still faintly aware that I was standing in a ballroom in a tuxedo, holding nothing anymore, no folder, no plan, no wedding to escape. William took my hand, the one still loosely curled around a coin 11 years and 1 entire lifetime old, and for the first time since I'd woken up at that altar, the chandeliers didn't feel like a countdown. They just felt like light. 3 weeks after the wedding, that wasn't imploded in front of half of Chicago's elite, William Blackwood, a man who once negotiated a hostile takeover without blinking, who reportedly made a state senator cry using only a raised eyebrow, tried to propose to me and dropped the ring into a bowl of soup. To be fair, it wasn't just any soup. It was homemade on the stove, at the tiny lake house he'd bought under a fake name specifically, so nobody could track us down for a week. He'd been building up to something all evening, unusually quiet, unusually fidgety, checking his jacket pocket every 4 minutes like it might have wandered off. And when he finally reached in to grab the ring box, his elbow clipped the ladle clipped the bowl, and the ring went in with a soft, unmistakable plop. We both stared at the bowl. "Well," I said, "that's one way to hide it from me." "I had a whole speech," William said, staring at his own soup like it had personally betrayed him. "You can still give the speech. I'll just be eating around a diamond." He fished it out, wiped it on a dish towel with the grim determination of a man trying to salvage a business deal, and got down on one knee right there on the kitchen tile, ring held up, slightly damp, faintly smelling of rosemary. "Ethan Miller," he said, "or whoever you actually are under that name. I've spent 11 years carrying a coin I couldn't explain to anyone. I'd like to spend the rest of my life not having to explain you either. Marry me." That was a surprisingly good recovery for a man who just proposed with soup hands, I said. And then, because he looked genuinely nervous, which was a look I intended to treasure forever, I added, "Yes. Obviously yes. Get up, your knee's going to stick to the tile. We got married 2 months later. Small, on purpose, at a courthouse instead of a ballroom, because I had developed a personal and permanent aversion to chandeliers." Lucas served as our extremely enthusiastic witness, wore a suit with a tie that said "World's Okayest Best Man," and cried more than either of us. Victoria attended stiffly, in a suit the color of reluctant approval, and gave a toast that managed to congratulate us without once mentioning the words asset or transfer, which I considered enormous personal growth on her part. Domestic life with a former Mafia king, it turns out, is mostly normal, except for the parts that really aren't. For one thing, William cannot cook. This is a man who can read a balance sheet the way most people read a stop sign, who once talked an entire boardroom into agreeing with him using nothing but silence and a raised eyebrow, and he cannot make toast without setting off the smoke alarm. I came home one evening to find him standing in front of a small kitchen fire with the calm, unbothered expression of someone reviewing a mildly disappointing quarterly report. "It's under control," he said, over the sound of the fire alarm. "It is extremely not under control. I was making you dinner. You were making me a lawsuit. We ordered pizza. We always order pizza." I've since banned him from the stove entirely, a decision he accepted with the quiet dignity of a man who knows when he's lost. For another thing, we adopted a cat, a small, judgmental, gray creature named Ledger, because I have a sense of humor about my old profession and no shame about it, and Ledger has decided, for reasons known only to himself, that William is the enemy. William, a man capable of dismantling a rival's entire business empire in one phone call, has been personally defeated by an 8-pound animal who refuses to sit on his lap and instead sits directly on top of any document he's trying to read, staring at him the entire time like a tiny, furious auditor. "He likes you," William said once, watching Ledger settle onto my chest with a contented sigh while glaring at William from across the room. "He has excellent taste. He knocked my phone into the bathtub yesterday, like I said. Excellent taste." Then there's the remote control situation, which has become a genuine Cold War. William, a man who owns actual buildings, has apparently never once in his life learned to share a television, and I, a man with a professionally cultivated laziness that predates this entire reincarnation, refuse to get up and find my own remote when his is right there. This results in nightly negotiations that would put actual UN diplomats to shame. I had a very long day, he told me last Tuesday, reaching for the remote after I'd very clearly claimed it first. "I had a very long life," I said, holding it out of reach. "I died and got reincarnated. Outrank you, that's not how outranking works. It is in this house." He didn't get the remote. I let him pick the takeout order instead, mostly because I'm not a monster, and also because I've discovered that letting William win small, harmless things makes him weirdly, disproportionately happy, in the quiet way of a man who spent most of his life only ever winning large, exhausting things. Some nights, we don't do anything remarkable at all. We just sit on the couch, Ledger glaring at William from a safe distance, some show neither of us is really watching playing in the background, and I think about how strange it is that I spent an entire lifetime being useful to strangers for a paycheck, and this lifetime, I get to be genuinely, unapologetically lazy with someone who actually likes watching me do it. Turns out the trick was never pretending to be someone smaller, softer, easier to overlook. It was finding the one person who noticed anyway, and stuck around for the real thing, soup-stained proposal and all. If you made it this far, drop your favorite moment in the comments. I need to know if it was the soup ring or the security system incident. And follow the channel for more chaotic, soft, slightly lazy love stories just like this one. New chaos every week, guaranteed.